In a world where you're in Mr. Davis's class, one video, one student, one teacher, you're gonna watch this video. So let's get started. File, new, ActionScript 3.0. Let's go ahead and save this right now, right away, as functions video, because that's what this video is going to be about. So I already have one saved, so I'm just going to replace what I've got, and now we can get started. So first order of business, we are good Samaritans, renaming my layer to actions, and I'm going to click on my actions layer on frame 1, tap F9, and now we can begin coding. So this is about functions, and in our previous video we went over we did an introduction to functions. Now I'm going to go a little bit deeper. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is something called scope. So I'm going to first create a function just like we normally would. Create a function, put a comment telling me what I'm doing. Say function, I'm going to call it my scope function because I'm talking about scope here. I'm using this as an example to talk about scope. So remember, we have our function keyword, our name, our arguments, which for now we don't have any, colon, and then saying it's return type void. And I'm going to go over what this return type is in this video. So for now we're working with scope. So what scope is essentially it's a limitation. So imagine like you're looking at a gun scope, you can only see certain things. That's kind of how scope with code works. So to demonstrate, I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to call it var. I'll just call it inside var, inside var, not insider, and it'll be type int and set it equal to 0. So this variable, I'm doing something that I haven't done before in any of the other videos. I have created this variable inside of my function, or inside of a pair of curly brackets, instead of at the very top where I have normally been doing it. And what this does is it only makes this variable visible or usable or accessible inside or in between these two curly brackets. So if I were to try and access inside var, so I'll say access or inside var equals 1, outside of these curly brackets, I'm not going to be able to do this, and it's going to throw an error. So I'm going to save and run just to prove it. And if I go into my compiler errors, it's saying layer actions frame 1 line 9 access of undefined property inside var. I'm going to double click on this and it'll bring me to where my error was, which is right here. And it's saying it's undefined. Well, we defined it here, but outside of this scope, this variable is not accessible. So let's go ahead and say cannot access this here because of scope, and let's go ahead and comment that out. So now that we have that, let's make a thing here, comment here saying can only access inside of my scope function. So this whole scope thing is supposed to work exactly the same with if statements as well. Like if you create a variable inside of curly brackets, it's only accessible inside those curly brackets. Sometimes Flash lets you get away with it. So I'm going to say as a rule, if you want to create variables inside of a function, that's okay. Just know that you can't access them outside of that function. And I'm going to say do not create variables inside of if statements. Sometimes, like I said, Flash will let you get away with it sometimes, but don't do it. It'll mess you up later, I promise you. So let's go a little deeper. In one of our previous videos about if statements, we went over nested if statements. Well, you can also nest functions. You can put functions inside of other functions, and we're going to do this right now. I'm going to create a function inside of my scope function and make sure it's tabbed out like this. Function, we're creating functionception. Like Inception. If you haven't seen the movie, sorry, can't help you. Give it type void. Oops, put curly bracket. So function keyword, name of our function, arguments, which there are none, so just open close parentheses, colon, give it the return type, which we don't have one yet. I haven't gone over that yet, so it is void. Don't question the master. So inside of functionception, we are going to say inside var plus plus and then end with a semicolon. Now I haven't gone over this plus plus yet, but basically what it does, it's the same as doing plus equals 1. So all this is doing is saying adding 1 to inside var. So it's just a shorter way of writing it. You can still write inside var plus equals 1 or inside var equals inside var plus 1, whatever you want to do. I'm just showing you the way I prefer to do it because it's quicker and you can get more work done. So now we've created my scope function. We've created inside var inside of my scope function. And we've created functionception inside of my scope function. And functionception, just like inside var, can only be accessed inside of my scope function. So I'm going to copy this comment and now just put this right here, paste it in, so that way we know what our rules are. But if we remember from our last video, we can create all the functions we want, but nothing is going to happen until we actually call our function. So let's go ahead and call, okay, before we call our function, let me go over one thing. So I'm going to prove you cannot call functionception outside of my scope function by calling it right here. So I just typed in functionception, the pair of parentheses, and then end with a semicolon. So I'm going to save and run. And now you can see it's giving me the same error, or very similar error to what it was doing when I was trying to access inside var outside of my scope function. So I'm going to double click, it'll take me to the error. I am going to exit out of my program that was running, and now I'm just going to comment this out. So cannot access this, no, cannot access these now. We cannot access these here because of scope. And let's throw a couple of extra line comments in here just for beauty's sake. So now that we've done that, we can call our function. So let's call my scope function. So I'm going to copy the name, paste it right here, open close parentheses, end with a semicolon, and now we are calling my scope function. So what's going to happen when we call my scope function? Well, we're going to go here, right? We're going to go in the first line. It's going to create this inside variable, set it equal to 0, and then it's going to go here, create this functionception function, but it's never going to go inside of functionception unless we call functionception. So if I were to go down here, below where I created functionception, I'm just going to trace out whatever inside var is. So inside var, and with the semicolon, and I'm going to run this. So just to prove it, it says 0, as although we've added 1, or we will be adding 1 when we go inside functionception, we never call it, so we set inside var to 0, it stays 0. So let's make the magic happen. So before we go ahead, let's add a string right here and say before functionception, and then let's copy this and say after functionception. And if you can predict the future, guess what's going in between? A call to functionception. Bam. I'll put a comment saying call functionception. So now what's going to happen, we're going to call my scope function. It's going to create inside var, set it equal to 0. It's not going to go here yet. So first it's going to trace before functionception and then the value of inside var. It's going to call functionception. When we call functionception, it's going to go here, add 1 to our inside variable, and then it's going to go into our trace and say after functionception, here's the value of our variable. So let's save and run and hope that that works like we thought it will. And so we have before functionception and after functionception. So let me show you one more thing. I'm going to call my scope function twice. just to show you how, because we created this variable inside of my scope function, it's going to be created and made new every time we call it. So if we call my scope function twice, it'll say the values for inside var will be 0 and 1 each time we call it. So I'm going to run it just so I'm not talking. I'm going to show you. We had before 0, 1, then we call it again. It creates inside var again and says 0 and 1. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to go below these comments here, and I'm going to create another function. Create a function, and I'm going to say function return void. Give it type void. You should know how to do this by now. So here we go. So now we've created a function, and I'm going to go over a little bit about the return type. Sorry, actually I'm going to show you how to use return values, or how to return a value. So right now we're still returning void. Our return type is void, so this one's a little different from overall, but just to explain what's going on, let's write out trace la 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 la. We will never get here. And so, okay, so we've written out trace la 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 la, we will never get here. And when we call return void, so let's call it right below it. Return void. Oops. It will go in here and trace out la la la, we will never get here. But now I'm going to show you how to use return. So what return does is it returns a value and it exits your function. So what's happening here, or sorry, let me just show you. It'll be easier. So I'm going to write out the word return. It's a keyword, and just end with a semicolon. So because we're returning void, we're returning nothing, we can just write out the word return, and that's okay because we're returning nothing. But later on, we will have to actually put something after return saying this is what we're going to return. So what's happening here, we're going to call return void. It's going to go, yeah, let me write another trace statement above it. Let's do this. We will get here, and exclamation point because we're excited. So what's going to happen is it's going to call return void. We're going to go into our function. We're going to trace out we will get here. It's going to hit return, return a void, return nothing, and it's going to exit our function and never, ever, ever, ever get to la 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 la. We will never get here. So I'm going to run the function to prove this to you. And now we have our two before and after function exceptions. Then it says we will get here. And notice, like I promised, you never get to la 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 la, we will never get here. So let's create one more function. And create a function. And I'll say function, we're going to call this return string. I'm going to put open and close parentheses because we don't have any arguments. Give it a colon, and instead of void, we're going to say string. So I'm going to put open and close curly brackets. And so what we've done so far, we've used our function keyword, named our function return string, given it no arguments, so just open close parentheses, and saying that we're going to return a type that is a string. So before we did void, now we're doing string. So the way this works is whenever you use the return keyword, you have to give it a string to return. So let me go ahead and run this really quick so that it will not like us. And it's saying now this function does not return a value. So I'm going to double click on my compiler error, and now it's going to take me to this curly bracket down here. Well, this is the function it's talking about, return string. So when we create a function that returns a value or a data type, we actually have to return something. If we don't return something, it's going to break. It's going to get all messed up, and no one's going to be happy. So what we're going to do is all we're going to do is type return, put a space, and you don't have to surround these in parentheses. I do because it makes me happy and it's easy to read. I'm going to put open parentheses and give it a string and just say this is a return value, end my double quotes, end my parenthesis, and then end with a semicolon. So now whenever we call this function, it's going to return a value, return a string that says this is a return value. But what exactly does return mean? What exactly does return do? Well, I'm going to go ahead and show you. So if I were to just call return string right here, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to call, it's going to return this value, and we're not tracing anything. We're not doing anything with this value. It's just returning it. Like, well, where does it go? What does it do? Nothing. Not if we leave it like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write trace. I'm going to put open close parentheses and end my line. And now we're going to take, as part of the return string, I'm just going to cut it with Control X, delete that extra semicolon, and paste it in here. So now what's going to happen is whatever is in return string, our function return string, it's going to return our string, and that's going to get replaced wherever we write this, kind of like how we'd write a variable. So we still have to do, write out the function, have our open and close parentheses after it for it to work correctly. But what it's going to do, it's going to go inside of our function. It's going to run until it hits this return, and it's going to return, this is a return value. It's going to substitute that in here, and now our trace statement is going to write out whatever is in our, whatever our return value was from return string. So I'm going to run this. And now we have, this is a return value. So that's nice and dandy, but that's a little ugly. So let's go ahead and create a variable down here. Oops. I'm making a comment. Create a variable. And I'm going to say var hold return value, make it type string, and we're going to set it equal to whatever our return string function returns. So I'm going to take this out of here, cut it with Control X, paste with Control V, and end with a semicolon. So now we're going to create our variable hold return value, and we're going to assign it a value of whatever comes back from return string function. So that's going to be, this is a return value. Now in trace, let's go ahead and trace out hold return value. So I just copied and pasted that there. So I'm saving, and now I'm running. And now we still have, this is a return value. So we went over a couple of things, actually a lot of things, and I'm going to sum it up right now for you in case you forgot. We went over functions. We went over creating functions inside of functions and creating variables inside of functions. We went over scope, in that we cannot, anything we create inside of a function cannot be accessed outside of the function. Let's see, we went over using plus plus, which instead of plus equals 1, you just put plus plus, it adds 1 to whatever your variable is, as long as it's an integer or number. Remember that when we call a function that has variables created inside of it, that they get recreated every time you call it. So remember from our output, it was saying 0, 1, and then 0, 1 again. So moving down, we learned about returning. So when we're using a return type of void, what it's going to do is, all you have to do is write return where you want it to end, and it's going to stop when you call that, it's going to exit out of that function whenever it gets to return. So for return void, it's going to go inside of our function. It's going to trace out we will get here, and then it will return and exit out of the function return void. And it'll never get to la 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 la, we will never get here. And the very last part was we created a function with a return type. So I use string for this one. You could use integer, and you can use number, you can use boolean, you could use whichever you wanted. But what this is going to do is it has to return a value. It has to be the type that you told it. So when we call return string here, it's going to go inside here, hit this line. It's going to return the value. This is a return value. It's going to substitute it in here. and it's going to push this as a return value into our variable, in this case hold return value, then it's going to trace it out. So that's a lot of information for one video. Don't panic, soak it in, and have a great day.